The velvet box felt cold against my palm. It had been my mother's, a small, unassuming thing, lined with faded burgundy velvet, holding something far more precious than its outward appearance suggested. Tonight, it was meant to hold a promise, a future. I had envisioned Claire's surprise, the way her eyes, the color of a twilight sky, would widen, reflecting the firelight dancing on the facets of the ring nestled within. I had rehearsed the words, practiced the casual slump against the mantelpiece, the carefully crafted nonchalance designed to hide the pounding of my heart. The image of Claire, radiant and laughing, agreeing to share her life with me, had been a beacon in the weeks leading up to tonight, a comforting warmth against the persistent chill of my mother's absence. Now, the velvet felt like ice, the imagined warmth a cruel phantom limb. The apartment was silent, the remnants of the planned celebratory dinner congealing on the table. The aroma of rosemary and garlic, once a promise of shared intimacy, now hung heavy, a suffocating reminder of what had been lost. Lost not through some grand tragedy, some unavoidable twist of fate, but by a single, carelessly uttered sentence. A sentence so casually cruel, it had ripped through the carefully constructed tapestry of my hopes, leaving behind a tattered mess of disillusionment. I picked up the photo album, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. It had been my mother's gift to Claire, a collection of carefully curated moments from my life, a silent testament to the love she wouldn't be able to express in person. I had hoped it would bridge the chasm between our worlds, a tangible representation of the values I held dear: family, love, resilience. Now, it felt like a misplaced offering, a naive attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable. I traced the outline of my mother's face in one of the photographs. A faded image of her laughing, holding me close, her eyes crinkling at the corners. The memory of her laughter echoed in the silence of the apartment, a stark contrast to the icy words that still rang in my ears. So sweet of his dead mother to send something from beyond the grave. Gregory Whitmore's voice, laced with amusement, dripped with the casual disdain of a man who had never known hardship, never experienced the gut-wrenching emptiness of loss. Claire had flinched, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face, quickly replaced with a strained smile directed at her father. She had murmured something about it being a thoughtful gesture, her voice thin and brittle. In that moment, the chasm between us widened, a gaping maw swallowing the fragile bridge I had so painstakingly constructed. I had seen the subtle shift in Claire's demeanor over the past few months, the increasing strain in her smiles whenever her family was present. I had attributed it to the pressure of merging our disparate worlds, the inevitable friction between old money and the self-made. I had told myself she was trying, that she loved me enough to navigate the complexities of her family's expectations. I had been so wrong. My hand clenched around the photo album, the edges digging into my skin. The pain was a welcome distraction from the dull ache in my chest. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure the image of the Claire I had fallen in love with, the woman who had laughed with me over cheap takeout, who had held my hand during my mother's illness, who had whispered promises of a future together. But the image was blurred, distorted by the intervening months of carefully crafted appearances and strained conversations. I had wanted her to see me, truly see me, beyond the veneer of my profession, beyond the label of suitable enough. I had wanted her to understand the values I carried within me, the values my mother had instilled, the values that defined who I was. But she hadn't seen, or perhaps she had seen and chosen to ignore, blinded by the glittering allure of her world, the world that valued pedigree over character, wealth over integrity. The realization was a bitter pill, but it was also liberating. The carefully constructed fantasy I had woven around our relationship, the belief that love could transcend the deep-seated prejudices of her family, crumbled away, leaving behind a raw, exposed truth. I couldn't build a future on a foundation of conditional acceptance, a foundation that could be so easily eroded by a single callous remark. I spent the rest of the evening in a numb haze, packing a bag with the essentials. The apartment, once a symbol of our shared dreams, now felt like a suffocating cage. I left the velvet box on the mantelpiece, the unopened photo album beside it. They were remnants of a future that would never be, a future I no longer wanted. Weeks later, a letter arrived, the familiar, elegant script of Claire's handwriting a stark contrast to the plain white envelope. I hesitated before opening it, a strange mix of apprehension and a reluctant curiosity swirling within me. Her words, carefully chosen, flowed across the page, an acknowledgement of her failings, of her complicity in the demise of our relationship. She wrote of the suffocating weight of her family's expectations, the insidious nature of a world that prized conformity above all else. She admitted that she hadn't been strong enough, hadn't been brave enough to choose me, to choose us, over the gilded cage of her upbringing. Liam, her brother, had added a postscript, a few simple lines expressing his understanding, his respect for my decision. It was a small act of validation, a flicker of humanity in the sterile landscape of the Whitmore world. I folded the letter, the crisp paper crinkling softly in my hand. There was a sense of bittersweet closure, a quiet understanding that some things, despite the depth of feeling, are simply not meant to be. The pain hadn't entirely vanished, but it was no longer a sharp, debilitating ache. It had softened into a dull throb, a reminder of a lesson learned, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but filled with possibility, a blank canvas waiting to be painted with the colors of my own choosing. The crystal chandeliers cast a brittle, glittering light over the Whitmore estate, refracting off the polished marble floors and the vacant smiles of Claire's relatives. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and old money, felt suffocating. I stood beside Claire, her hand loosely clasped in mine, a knot tightening in my chest. The evening had begun with an undercurrent of polite detachment, their veiled curiosity laced with a subtle disdain that pricked at my skin like 1,000 tiny needles. They asked about my work, about my humble beginnings, their words dripping with a condescending sweetness that left a bitter taste in my mouth. I saw it in the way Linda Whitmore, Claire's mother, held her champagne flute a little higher, her smile a fraction too tight, as I spoke about my late mother, a woman whose hands had been roughened by work, not manicures. I saw it in the fleeting glance exchanged between Gregory Whitmore, Claire's father, and his brother, a silent communication that spoke volumes about their assessment of my suitability. My mother. The thought of her brought a familiar ache to my chest. Even now, years after her passing, the memory of her warmth, her quiet strength, remained a vivid counterpoint to the sterile elegance of the Whitmore's world. A world Claire navigated with effortless grace, a world she seemed destined to inherit. I had initially been drawn to that grace, to the ease with which she moved through life, so different from my own scrappy existence. But tonight, that ease felt like a chasm between us, a gulf I wasn't sure I could bridge. "So, Ethan," Gregory Whitmore's voice boomed across the room, cutting through the polite murmur of conversation. He approached us, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand. "Tell me, what did your dear mother think of her son snagging a Whitmore?" He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that felt less like camaraderie and more like a claim of ownership. The blood drained from my face. The room seemed to tilt, the glittering chandeliers blurring into a dizzying kaleidoscope of light. My mother. He dared to speak of her, to reduce her memory to a punchline in his twisted game of social one-upmanship. The knot in my chest tightened, a burning ember of anger igniting in its core. Claire stiffened beside me. I felt her hand tremble in mine, a fleeting flicker of discomfort crossing her face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a strained smile. "Daddy," she said, her voice a soft reprimand, yet lacking the conviction I craved. "That's not funny." But it wasn't a genuine rebuke. It was a performance, a delicate balancing act between acknowledging my discomfort and appeasing her father. Her gaze flitted nervously between me and him, her eyes pleading with me to understand, to let it go. "Oh, come now, Claire," Gregory chuckled, oblivious to the turmoil churning within me. "Just a bit of fun." I'm sure the woman would have been thrilled. Thrilled. The word echoed in my mind, a hollow mockery of my mother's memory. My hand tightened around Claire's, my grip no longer affectionate, but a desperate plea for her to see, to truly understand the depth of my pain. "Ethan's mother was a wonderful woman, Daddy," Claire insisted, her voice a little stronger this time, but still laced with a hesitant undertone. "She would have been very happy for us." Her words, meant to soothe, felt like a betrayal. They weren't a defense of my mother, but a desperate attempt to smooth over the uncomfortable situation, to maintain the fragile harmony of her world. A world where my mother, a woman who had worked her fingers to the bone to provide for me, was reduced to a nameless, faceless entity, a convenient prop in their narrative of social climbing. I looked at Claire, truly looked at her, and for the first time, I saw not the woman I loved, but a stranger trapped within the gilded cage of her family's expectations. The carefully constructed facade of elegance and composure crumbled before my eyes, revealing the fragile, uncertain girl beneath. And in that moment, I knew that she would never choose me over them, that her loyalty to her world, to her family, would always supersede her love for me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me breathless and hollowed out. The hum of conversation around us faded into a distant drone. The glittering chandeliers seemed to mock me with their cold, indifferent brilliance. I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if I were watching the scene unfold from a great distance. Claire's hand felt cold and unfamiliar in mine. I disengaged my hand from hers, the silence that followed echoing louder than any words I could have uttered. Her eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear finally surfacing in their depths. But it was too late. The damage was done. The fragile illusion of our shared future had shattered, leaving behind only the bitter shards of reality. I turned and walked away, the weight of their judgment, their casual cruelty, pressing down on me. But beneath that weight, a new sensation began to emerge, a sense of liberation. I was walking away from a life that had never truly been mine, a life built on compromise and pretense. I was walking away from Claire, from the Whitmores, from their suffocating world of privilege and indifference. And in that moment of painful clarity, I knew I was finally walking towards myself. The muted gray light of a Boston morning filtered through the blinds, slicing across Ethan's face. He didn't stir. The remnants of a restless sleep clung to him, heavy and suffocating. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, a persistent, insistent thrum that mirrored the dull ache in his chest. He knew, without looking, that it was Claire. He'd known it would be. He'd known from a moment he'd shut the door of his apartment the previous night, severing the strained silence between them with a final, decisive click. He'd known then that this silence would be replaced by a barrage of calls, texts, pleas. But he didn't reach for it. He couldn't. The memory of the previous night, of the glittering, sterile dining room of the Whitmore estate, was still too raw, too vivid. He rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling. The popcorn texture seemed to shift and swirl, mimicking the turmoil within him. He'd gone to that dinner hoping for what? For acceptance? Understanding? Perhaps a flicker of recognition in Claire's eyes that his world, his past, held as much value as the gilded cage she'd grown up in. Instead, he'd received Gregory Whitmore's careless jab, a casual dismissal of his mother's memory disguised as a joke. A public school teacher, wasn't she, Ethan? Must have been quite the culture shock coming here. The words echoed in his mind, sharp and cold, a reminder of the insurmountable chasm that lay between them. He closed his eyes, the phone still buzzing, a relentless insect trapped against the wood of the nightstand. He saw his mother's face, etched with the weary lines of a life lived on the edge of financial stability, but radiating a warmth, a quiet strength that Claire's family, in all their opulence, seemed to lack. She'd worked 2 jobs to put him through school, sacrificing her own comfort so he could have a better future. And now, her memory, her sacrifice, had been reduced to a punchline. He'd seen Claire's reaction, the fleeting wince that had been quickly masked by a strained smile, a nervous glance at her father. That was the moment something inside him had snapped, a fine thread of hope severing irrevocably. It wasn't the joke itself, as cruel as it was Claire's silence. Her complicity. In that moment, he realized she valued her father's approval, her family's acceptance, more than she valued him. The phone finally stopped buzzing. A brief, fragile silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall. It was the sound of time moving forward, of a life he no longer wanted, a future he could no longer envision. He'd spent months, years even, trying to bridge the gap between their worlds, contorting himself, minimizing his own experiences to fit into her polished, prefabricated existence. He tried to see past the subtle condescension, the veiled judgments, the constant, unspoken reminder that he wasn't one of them. He'd told himself it was love, that Claire's affection was enough to overcome the differences, that they could build a life together despite the shadows cast by her family's disapproval. But the silence, that damning silence, had exposed the lie. It had revealed the fragility of their connection, the shallowness of her affections. He'd seen the fear in her eyes, the fear of being ostracized, of losing her privileged perch in the Whitmore hierarchy. And in that fear, he'd seen the truth. He wasn't loved, he was tolerated. A novelty, perhaps, an interesting diversion from the monotony of her predictable life. He sat up, the movement abrupt, jarring. He needed air. He walked to the window, pushing aside the blinds, letting the cool morning air wash over him. The city sprawled beneath him, a concrete tapestry of lives being lived, stories unfolding, independent of the suffocating world of the Whitmores. He breathed deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs, a cleansing, invigorating draft. He thought of his mother again. He could almost hear her voice, gentle and firm, reminding him of his worth, of the strength that resided within him. She had taught him to value integrity, to stand up for what he believed in, to never compromise his self-respect. He had forgotten that, lost it somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of the Whitmore mansion, amidst the whispers of disapproval and the suffocating weight of their expectations. He knew what he had to do. The decision, once a flickering ember of doubt, now burned with a clear, unwavering intensity. He couldn't stay. He couldn't continue to exist in this liminal space, constantly measuring his words, censoring his thoughts, erasing pieces of himself to appease a family who would never truly accept him. He deserved more. He deserved someone who saw him, truly saw him, not the distorted reflection projected through the prism of their wealth and prejudice. Days later, a letter arrived. The familiar, elegant script of Claire Whitmore stood out against the plain white envelope. He hesitated before opening it, a strange mix of apprehension and resignation swirling within him. "Ethan," the letter began, the ink a stark black against the creamy paper. "I understand. Truly I do. I've spent the last few days replaying that night, seeing the hurt in your eyes, hearing the silence that spoke volumes. I was a coward, Ethan. I chose the comfort of my familiar world over the uncertainty of standing by you. I prioritized my family's acceptance over your respect, and in doing so, I lost you. I understand if you can't forgive me. Perhaps one day I'll learn to forgive myself. Claire." He folded the letter, the crisp paper crinkling softly in his hands. He felt no anger, no resentment, only a profound sense of sadness, a quiet ache for what could have been. He placed the letter on the table, a final, tangible reminder of a chapter closed, a life he'd left behind. He turned towards the window, the city spread out before him, a canvas of endless possibilities. He breathed deeply, the air filled with the promise of a new beginning. The wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate seemed to sneer at him, their intricate curls twisting into a silent mockery. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles bone white against the worn leather. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, painting the scene in a deceptive tranquility that grated against the turmoil within him. He hadn't slept properly since the dinner. The image of Gregory Whitmore's jovial face, the casual cruelty of his words about Ethan's mother, replayed in his mind like a broken record. It was just a joke, Ethan, Claire had whispered, her hand fluttering on his arm. But the words, light as they were, had landed with the weight of a tombstone. He parked the car, the engine's silence amplifying the roaring in his ears. This wasn't just about a joke. It was about a chasm, a fundamental disconnect between their worlds that he'd been foolish to ignore. The heavy oak door swung open before he could even raise his hand to the knocker. Claire stood there, framed by the opulence of the foyer, a fragile porcelain doll in a gilded cage. Her eyes, usually sparkling with an easy joy, were shadowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. A knot tightened in Ethan's chest. He'd come here seeking clarity, seeking some semblance of understanding. But the sight of her, so clearly distressed, stirred a conflicting wave of tenderness. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped inside, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed the finality he felt creeping into his heart. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies, a fragrance he'd once found comforting, now cloying, suffocating. "We need to talk," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He followed her into the formal living room, the very room where the wound had been inflicted. The plush furniture, the gleaming antiques, all seemed to radiate an unspoken judgment. He sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, feeling like an intruder in this meticulously curated world. Claire perched on the opposite end, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile remains of their relationship. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she finally said, her voice trembling. I didn't handle it right." The words hung in the air, inadequate, hollow. He watched her, searching her face for a flicker of true understanding, but found only a bewildered hurt. "She doesn't get it," he realized with a sinking heart. "She doesn't understand why this cut so deep." "Handled it right?" he echoed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Your father insulted my mother, Claire. He mocked her memory, and you just sat there." Claire's eyes filled with tears. I know. I should have said something. I froze." Her voice cracked. "He's my father, Ethan. It's complicated." The word hung between them, a flimsy shield against the storm raging inside him. Complicated. He knew about complicated. He knew about the crushing weight of grief, the silent struggle to rebuild a life shattered by loss. But Claire's complicated felt different, coated in a layer of privilege that insulated her from the true sting of the world. "Complicated?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Your father made a cruel, insensitive joke about my dead mother. And your response is that it's complicated?" He stood up, pacing the length of the room, the ornate rug softening his steps, but doing nothing to quell the anger simmering within him. "I try to talk to him later," Claire pleaded, her voice rising in desperation. "I told him he was wrong, that he shouldn't have said those things." Ethan stopped pacing, turning to face her. "And?" he asked, his voice flat. A flicker of fear crossed her face. He knew the answer before she spoke. He didn't really listen, she whispered, her gaze dropping to her hands. "He said I was being oversensitive, that it was just a bit of harmless banter." Her words were a confirmation of his deepest fears. He saw it then, with a chilling clarity. Claire's loyalty, her comfort, resided firmly within the gilded cage of her family's approval. He, an outsider, would always be secondary. He felt a strange calm descend upon him, the turbulent emotions of the past few days settling into a quiet resignation. "So, you chose to stay silent," he said, his voice devoid of accusation, merely stating a fact. Tears streamed down Claire's face. "No, it's not like that," she sobbed. "I love you, Ethan. You know I do." The words, once a source of comfort and joy, now felt like a hollow echo. He looked at her, at the woman he had believed he could build a future with, and saw a stranger. A stranger trapped in a world he could never truly be a part of. "I don't think you do," he said softly, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. He turned and walked towards the door, the scent of lilies clinging to him like a shroud. He didn't look back. The click of the latch echoed in the sudden silence, the sound of a door closing, not just on a room, but on a chapter of his life. As he drove away, the wrought iron gates no longer seemed to sneer. They simply stood, silent sentinels guarding a world he no longer desired. The silence after the door closed was a peculiar thing. It wasn't simply the absence of noise, but the sudden vacuum where her presence used to be. It pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating, a constant reminder of the chasm that now yawned between us. For weeks, the apartment felt haunted by the ghost of laughter that wasn't there, by the phantom scent of her perfume clinging to the air. I moved through the days in a fog, the routines of life work, eating, sleeping, feeling mechanical and hollow. The blueprints I studied swam before my eyes, the steel and concrete of my profession failing to anchor me to reality. Mother's absence had been a dull ache, a constant presence in its very lack. This, however, was a sharp, piercing wound, the betrayal of hope slicing deeper than grief. Time, they say, heals all wounds. But time, I discovered, is a fickle physician. It dulled the edges of the raw pain, yes, but it also left behind a strange numbness, a detachment that made everything seem distant and unreal. I buried myself in work, the demanding nature of structural engineering offering a temporary reprieve from the turmoil within. The precision of calculations, the weight of responsibility, these became my refuge, a place where emotions held no sway. One drizzling afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I saw him, Liam, Claire's younger brother. He was leaning against a sleek, black car, the rain beating on his expensive coat. He looked up as I approached, a hesitant smile touching his lips. A part of me wanted to turn away, to avoid any connection to that world that had caused me so much pain. But Liam, unlike the rest of his family, had always treated me with a quiet respect. "Ethan," he said, his voice subdued. "It's been a while." I nodded, my throat suddenly tight. The casual greeting felt laden with unspoken things, the weight of Claire hanging in the air between us. "I just wanted to say," Liam continued, his gaze fixed on a rain-slicked street, "that I understand." He paused, as if searching for the right words. "Why you did what you did. It took courage." His words, simple yet profound, struck a chord within me. It was the first time anyone, let alone a member of the Whitmore family, had acknowledged the validity of my decision. A wave of emotion washed over me, relief, gratitude, a flicker of something akin to vindication. I managed a curt nod, unable to articulate the complex mix of feelings swirling inside me. Claire, she's not doing well," Liam finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. She gave me this, asked me to give it to you." He held out a small, worn photo album, the one I'd made for her, filled with pictures of our life together, our hopes and dreams captured in faded snapshots. I stared at the album, my heart constricting in my chest. The memories associated with it, once a source of joy, now felt like a bittersweet ache. I hesitated, unsure if I could bear to touch it, to reopen the wounds that time had begun to heal. But something in Liam's eyes, a silent plea, compelled me to take it. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice hoarse. Liam nodded, gave me a small, sad smile, and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the gray mist of the city. Weeks later, I found myself at a casual gathering, a network event for engineers. The room buzzed with conversations, the clinking of glasses, the forced laughter of polite acquaintances. I stood near the window, observing the scene with a detached curiosity, feeling like an outsider looking in. And then I saw her. Claire. She stood across the room, her back to me, her posture stiff and tense. The familiar curve of her neck, the way her hair fell around her shoulders, sent a jolt of something not quite pain, not quite longing, but a strange, hollow echo of what once was. I almost turned away, my instinct to protect myself from further hurt kicking in. But something held me back, a strange compulsion to see her face, to gauge the impact of the months that had passed. As she turned, our eyes met across the crowded room. The initial shock in her expression quickly gave way to something else, a profound sadness, a vulnerability I had never seen before. She walked towards me, her steps hesitant, as if unsure of her welcome. The room seemed to fade away, the noise and laughter receding into a distant hum. It was just us, standing in the silent aftermath of everything that had been broken. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. I simply nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She held out the photo album, the same one Liam had returned to me. "I looked through it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And I saw how blind I was." She paused, her eyes searching mine. "I saw how much I hurt you." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken regrets. I stared at her, my mind reeling. This wasn't the Claire I knew, the Claire who had prioritized her family's approval over our love. This was someone different, someone who had finally confronted the truth of her own actions. "I understand why you left," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "You deserve better. You deserve someone who could see you, truly see you, for who you are." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. And that wasn't me. Not then. Her admission, so raw and honest, disarmed me. The anger, the resentment, the bitterness that I had carried for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a strange sense of peace. "I'm trying to change," she whispered, her gaze unwavering. "To be better, to understand, to see." Her words hung in the air, unanswered. I didn't know what to say, how to respond to this new Claire, this woman who was both familiar and utterly unknown. The chasm between us remained, a deep fissure carved by months of hurt and misunderstanding. But in that moment, in the shared silence and the unspoken acknowledgement of our past, a fragile bridge began to form, a tentative connection across the divide. The crystal chandeliers cast a shimmering, almost hallucinatory light across the ballroom, transforming the already opulent space into something ethereal, unreal. Ethan adjusted his tie, the silk feeling like a noose tightening around his throat. The air, thick with the perfume of lilies and the low hum of polite conversation, pressed in on him, each breath a conscious effort. Around him, Claire's world swirled in a kaleidoscope of designer gowns and practiced smiles. He felt adrift, a lone dinghy tossed on a sea of champagne and superficiality. He'd known coming tonight would be an ordeal, but the sheer weight of it, the palpable disdain radiating from the gilded cages of Claire's social circle, was suffocating. He caught Claire's eye across the room. She was radiant, a queen in her element, her laughter echoing like wind chimes in the vast space. A pang of something complex, a mixture of admiration and a chilling premonition, twisted in his gut. He wanted, so desperately, to belong in this world with her, but the chasm between them felt wider than ever tonight. He'd barely managed 2 sips of a champagne when a group of Claire's acquaintances, their faces blurred by expensive alcohol and an inherent sense of entitlement, descended upon them. Their words, though couched in polite pleasantries, dripped with condescension. He saw the subtle flickers of amusement in their eyes as they inquired about his line of work, their tone implying a barely concealed mockery. "Structural engineer," he'd replied, his voice steady, though his insides churned. He saw Claire stiffen beside him, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. A flicker of hope, a desperate plea for her to deflect the veiled insults, ignited within him. "Oh, how fascinating," one woman drawled, her eyes scanning his suit, a silent appraisal that left him feeling naked and exposed. "So you're the one responsible for those functional buildings we see around town." The others tittered politely, their laughter like shards of glass piercing the thin veneer of civility. He felt Claire's hand on his arm, a fleeting touch that offered no comfort. He knew what she was doing, appeasing them, protecting her own image. The hope within him withered, replaced by a cold, hard nod of disappointment. He forced a smile, a grotesque imitation of genuine amusement, and countered with a dry, "Indeed. Someone has to ensure your penthouses don't crumble under the weight of their own extravagance." The laughter died abruptly, replaced by a brittle silence. He saw a flash of anger in Claire's eyes, directed not at her friends, but at him. For a moment, he hated himself for the bitterness that seeped into his words, for the ugliness he felt rising within him. He hated this world, this gilded cage that held Claire captive, and he hated the invisible bars that kept him out. The evening wore on, a slow, torturous descent into a world he didn't understand and couldn't navigate. He felt like an exhibit in a museum, scrutinized and judged by unseen eyes. Each interaction, each forced smile, chipped away at his resolve. He found himself retreating further into his own thoughts, a silent observer in a play where he was cast as the fool. The climax, if it could be called that, came during a conversation with Gregory Whitmore, Claire's father. The older man, his face flushed with wine, clapped Ethan on the shoulder with a jovial familiarity that felt utterly insincere. "So, Ethan," he boomed, his voice carrying over the surrounding conversations, "heard you're quite the handyman. Must have learned a thing or two from your mother." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The memory of his mother, her hands calloused from years of hard work, her unwavering love, a constant source of strength, flashed before his eyes. The casual dismissal, the thinly veiled mockery of her memory, was a blow to the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face, his body going rigid. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to shatter the facade of polite conversation with the raw, agonizing grief that gnawed at his soul. But he did nothing. He simply stared at Gregory Whitmore, his eyes burning with a mixture of pain and disbelief. He heard Claire's sharp intake of breath beside him, felt her hand tighten on his arm again. This time, however, the touch felt different, laced with a desperate plea for him to remain silent, to maintain the fragile peace of her world. He looked at her, searching her eyes for a flicker of understanding, a spark of shared outrage. He found none. Instead, he saw fear. Fear of her father's disapproval, fear of the social repercussions, fear of disrupting the delicate balance of her carefully constructed life. He turned away, the weight of her silence crushing him. He moved through the crowd, a ghost in his own life, until he found himself on the balcony, gasping for air as if he'd been drowning. The cool night air against his skin was a welcome relief, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, trying to quell the storm raging within him. When he opened them again, Claire was standing beside him. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and apprehension. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I'm sorry." He looked at her, the words echoing in the vast emptiness of his disappointment. He wanted to believe her, to accept her apology, to cling to the fragile hope that remained. But the laughter, the whispers, the casual cruelty of her world still echoed in his ears. He turned back to the ballroom, the scene below a grotesque tableau of wealth and indifference. "They're still laughing, Claire," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The words hung in the air between them, a stark indictment of everything that separated them. He didn't need to explain. She understood. He saw it in the flicker of shame that crossed her face, in the way she averted her gaze, in the trembling of her hands. In that moment, he knew it was over. The chasm between them, once a subtle fissure, had widened into an impassable gulf. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't bridge it. Not anymore. The chilled air from the car's vents did little to cool the burning tension that filled the small space. Outside, the city lights blurred into streaks of white and gold, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence within the Lexus. Claire's knuckles were white against the leather of her purse, her gaze fixed on the passing cityscape. Each streetlight that flashed by seemed to illuminate another crack in the fragile facade of their relationship. Ethan watched her, the curve of her jaw tight, the elegant lines of her profile etched with a tension that mirrored his own. He knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in his chest, that this was it. The glittering gala, the forced smiles, the casual cruelty of her father's joke, it had all culminated in this suffocating silence. He wondered, with a flicker of bitter amusement, if she was rehearsing an apology that wouldn't touch the deep wound her family had carved into his soul. "Ethan," Claire finally began, her voice barely a whisper, as if the word itself was a physical effort. He didn't respond, his gaze still fixed on the city lights, each one a tiny, cold star in the vast indifference of the night. He knew what she would say, the familiar litany of excuses, her family's ways, their upbringing, the unspoken, yet ever-present, chasm between their worlds. He could almost hear her thoughts swirling behind those carefully composed features. The internal struggle between her loyalty to her family and the flicker of guilt she undoubtedly felt. He imagined her weighing the comfort of her privileged life against the discomfort of confronting her own complicity. The thought brought a fresh wave of weariness. "I'm sorry," she continued, her voice gaining a fraction of strength, though it still trembled with an unspoken fragility. "About my father. He doesn't think before he speaks sometimes." The words hung in the air, brittle and hollow. He finally turned to look at her, his gaze steady, unwavering. "It's not just your father, Claire," he said, his voice low and even, each word carefully measured. "It's the entire atmosphere, the subtle jabs, the condescending smiles, the way your mother looks at me like I'm some charity case." He paused, the image of Linda Whitmore's thinly veiled disdain flashing before his eyes. "It's the constant reminder that I don't belong." Claire flinched, her carefully constructed composure cracking. He saw a flicker of genuine hurt in her eyes, but it was quickly masked by a familiar defensiveness. They need time to adjust," she murmured, the words sounding rote, as if she'd rehearsed them 1,000 times. "They'll come around. They'll see how much I care about you." He closed his eyes, the faint scent of her perfume, usually a source of comfort, now a suffocating reminder of the chasm that separated them. "It's not about them coming around, Claire," he said, his voice laced with a weariness that went deeper than bone. "It's about me, about my self-respect, about not wanting to spend my life constantly proving my worth to people who will never truly see me." The car slowed to a stop at a red light, the sudden stillness amplifying the tension. He looked out at the street, at the anonymous faces passing by, each one absorbed in their own private world. He thought of his mother, of her quiet strength, her unwavering love. A love that had never required validation from anyone. "I don't want to raise a family in a world that mocks love, Claire," he said, the words echoing in the confined space of the car. The statement hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. It wasn't just about her family's casual cruelty. It was about the world they represented. A world where love was a commodity, measured in social standing and financial security. A world where genuine connection was sacrificed at the altar of societal expectations. Claire turned to face him, her eyes wide, a flicker of understanding finally breaking through the carefully constructed walls of her upbringing. "Ethan," she began, but he raised a hand, silencing her. "It's over, Claire," he said, his voice soft yet firm. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on a red light that pulsed like a wounded heart. "We're not good for each other. We want different things." The silence returned, heavier this time, imbued with the finality of his words. The light changed to green, and the car moved forward, carrying them away from each other, into the uncertain landscape of their separate futures. Weeks later, a letter arrived. The familiar, elegant script of Claire's handwriting brought a pang of bittersweet nostalgia. He hesitated before opening it, bracing himself for the familiar justifications, the veiled accusations. But the words that filled the page surprised him. There are no excuses, no pleas for reconciliation. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement of her own failings, a recognition of the deep incompatibility that had ultimately fractured their relationship. "You were right to leave," she wrote. I understand that now. I was so caught up in my world, in my family's expectations, that I couldn't see what truly mattered. You deserved more than I could give you. You deserved someone who saw you, truly saw you, and loved you for who you are, not for what you could offer. The words resonated with a quiet honesty that he hadn't expected. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something more. It was an acknowledgement of his worth, a validation of his decision. He folded the letter, a strange sense of peace settling in his chest. The city lights outside his window no longer seemed cold and indifferent. They shimmered with a quiet promise, a hint of the possibilities that lay ahead. The biting November wind whipped at Ethan's coat, tugging at the edges like an insistent ghost. He hunched his shoulders, the cold seeping into his bones, a familiar ache that mirrored the hollowness in his chest. 6 months. 6 months since he last stood here, the raw earth still fresh beneath a newly placed headstone. Now, frost dusted the grass, mirroring the fine layer of ice that seemed to have settled over his own heart. He knelt, the damp earth a stark contrast to the smooth, cold marble of the headstone. "Mom," he whispered, the word catching in his throat, a choked sob he quickly swallowed. The silence that followed was vast, broken only by the mournful rustle of the wind through the nearby cypress trees. Their branches swayed like weeping willows, their shadows stretching long fingers across the graves, as if trying to comfort the silent residents. He had imagined, foolishly perhaps, that time would dull the sharp edges of his grief, smooth them into something bearable. Instead, the pain had simply burrowed deeper, a constant, gnawing presence. He placed a single white lily on the grave, its delicate fragrance a fragile counterpoint to the earthy scent of decay. He remembered her love for lilies, how she'd fill their small apartment with them every spring, their perfume a beacon of hope amidst the gray concrete of their lives. Now, the scent was a phantom limb, a reminder of what he'd lost, what he'd chosen to lose. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the familiar contours of the photo album. He hesitated, a strange reluctance holding him back. It was a relic of a past he wasn't sure he wanted to revisit, a time when hope, however naive, had bloomed as brightly as the lilies on her grave. He closed his eyes, picturing Claire's face, the way her eyes had sparkled when she talked about her family's summer home in the Hamptons, the casual way she mentioned trips to Europe, a world so far removed from his own. He remembered the initial thrill, the dizzying sense of being pulled into a different orbit, a life he could only have dreamed of. He saw again the subtle disdain in her mother's eyes, the barely concealed amusement in her brother's, the way they treated him like an interesting anthropological specimen. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was his own insecurity, his working-class upbringing making him hypersensitive. But the truth, the brutal, undeniable truth, was that they had never truly accepted him. They had tolerated him, like a quirky accessory Claire had picked up on a whim. In Claire he exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that escaped like a trapped bird. He could still feel the phantom weight of her hand in his, the ghost of her lips on his. Had she ever truly seen him, beyond the projection of her own desires, beyond the novelty of a relationship outside her gilded cage? He opened the album, the worn leather cool against his skin. The photographs, faded and slightly curled at the edges, chronicled a love story that now felt like a dimly remembered dream. He and his mother, beaming at the camera, their faces etched with the simple joys of a life lived on the margins. He flipped through the pages, each photograph a shard of memory, sharp and bittersweet. His mother's graduation, her first job, their tiny apartment decorated for Christmas with handmade ornaments. A life so different, so starkly contrasted with the polished, opulent world Claire inhabited. He stopped at a photograph of his mother, taken just a few months before she died. Her eyes, though tired, held a spark of defiance, a quiet strength that had always inspired him. He closed his eyes, her words echoing in the chambers of his heart. "Never let anyone make you feel less than, Ethan. You are worthy of love, worthy of respect. Never forget that. Her words, once a source of comfort, had become a searing indictment of his own choices. He had compromised, he had minimized himself, he had allowed himself to be treated as less than, all for the illusion of a love that had ultimately proven to be as fragile as a butterfly's wing. The memory of the dinner party, the catalyst for the final fracture, surfaced with the agonizing clarity of a freshly inflicted wound. Gregory Whitmore, Claire's father, holding court at the head of the mahogany table, his voice booming with self-satisfied laughter. The casual, almost jovial way he dismissed Ethan's mother's profession, the thinly veiled mockery in his tone. A seamstress? How quaint, he chuckled, the word dripping with condescension. Claire had giggled nervously, then changed the subject, as if the casual dismissal of his mother's life's work was nothing more than a social faux pas, easily smoothed over. In that moment, the fragile scaffolding of their relationship had crumbled. He'd seen, with a chilling clarity, that Claire's world, with its unspoken rules and ingrained prejudices, would never be his. He had chosen to stay silent that night, a cowardly retreat into politeness. But the silence had festered, growing into a chasm between them, a chasm too wide to bridge. He'd left Claire a week later, a simple note left on her pillow. No grand pronouncements, no dramatic accusations. Just a quiet goodbye, a recognition that they were fundamentally incompatible, that their values, their very understanding of the world, were irreconcilably different. He'd walked away, carrying the weight of his grief and the sharp sting of disillusionment. The following weeks had been a blur of emptiness, a hollow echo of the life he'd almost had. He'd thrown himself into his work, the concrete and steel of his projects a tangible counterpoint to the ephemeral nature of his lost love. He'd avoided Claire's calls, her increasingly frantic messages, unable to face the inevitable recriminations, the accusations of abandonment. He closed the album, the smooth leather a comfort against his palm. The wind continued to howl, but its voice no longer sounded mournful. It sounded like acceptance, like the gentle whisper of forgiveness. He stood up, his knees stiff from the cold, and looked at his mother's grave. A faint smile touched his lips. "I'm okay, Mom," he whispered, the words a quiet affirmation, a promise to himself. "I'm okay." He turned to leave, a sense of peace settling over him, fragile yet undeniable. He had chosen his self-respect, his own sense of worth, over the gilded cage of Claire's world. And in that choice, he had finally honored his mother's memory, her unwavering belief in his inherent value. As he walked away, the crisp autumn leaves swirling around his feet, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. He was free. A few weeks later, a letter arrived, the familiar, elegant script of Claire's handwriting a stark contrast to the plain white envelope. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the unopened letter, a flicker of apprehension, a ghost of the old pain. He finally opened it, the crisp paper crackling in the silence of his apartment. "Ethan," the letter began, the single word a whispered plea. "I understand now. I understand why you left. I saw only what I wanted to see, blinded by the comfort of my own world. You deserve better. You deserve someone who truly saw you, who valued you for who you are, not for what you could offer. I failed you, and I understand if you can never forgive me." He folded the letter, the weight of her words a tangible presence in his hand. He didn't feel anger, not anymore. He felt a quiet sadness, a bittersweet ache for what might have been. He placed the letter on his desk, next to a framed photograph of his mother. It was time to move on. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor of Ethan's apartment. Dust motes danced in the golden light, illuminating the quiet emptiness that had settled since he'd packed away the last of Claire's things. It wasn't a dramatic purging, more a careful curation of memories he wasn't quite ready to discard. He ran a hand over the smooth surface of the mahogany photo album, its weight a familiar comfort in his palm. He'd almost forgotten about it, tucked away as it was in the bottom drawer of his desk. Within its pages resided remnants of a life he had envisioned, a life now fractured into pieces he wasn't sure how to reassemble. He sat on the edge of his bed, the springs creaking beneath him, a sound that echoed the weariness in his soul. His gaze drifted to the window, to the cityscape sprawling beneath the hazy sky. Each building, each flickering light, seemed to pulse with a life separate from his own, a life he no longer felt a part of. Had he ever truly been a part of Claire's world? The thought pricked at him, a dull ache that resonated with the emptiness in the apartment. He knew the answer, of course. He'd always been on the periphery, a guest in a gilded cage, never truly belonging. He opened the album, his fingers tracing the faded edges of photographs. Each one a captured moment, a frozen smile, a whispered promise that now rang hollow. There they were, on a beach in the Hamptons, the sun glinting off Claire's hair, her hand loosely clasped in his. He remembered the chill of the ocean breeze, the taste of salt on his lips, the way Claire had leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. He'd felt, in that moment, a fleeting sense of belonging, a fragile hope that he could bridge the chasm between their worlds. He saw it now, for what it was: a mirage, a shimmering illusion that dissolved under the harsh glare of reality. Turning the pages, he found another photograph: Claire's graduation, her family surrounding her, their smiles radiating wealth and privilege. He was on the edge of the frame, a shadowy figure almost swallowed by the opulent backdrop of the Whitmore estate. Even then, the subtle exclusion had been present, a silent message he'd chosen to ignore, blinded by the intoxicating allure of Claire's affection. He closed his eyes, the ghost of Gregory Whitmore's laughter echoing in his ears, the cruel words twisting like a knife in his gut. Your mother wouldn't have approved of this arrangement. The casual dismissal, the unspoken implication that his mother, a woman who had worked tirelessly to provide for him, was somehow less than, simply because she lacked the Whitmore's pedigree. He swallowed, the familiar lump of grief and anger rising in his throat. He tried to rationalize it, to convince himself that it was a harmless jest, a product of a different generation. But the casual cruelty had exposed the deep-seated prejudice that permeated the Whitmore family, a prejudice that Claire, despite her affection for him, was unable, or perhaps unwilling, to challenge. He opened his eyes, his gaze falling on a plain white envelope tucked between the pages. He recognized Claire's handwriting, the elegant script a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. He'd made his decision, drawn a line in the sand, and walked away. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the envelope. A part of him, a small, stubborn part, still clung to the hope that she would understand, that she would fight for him. But deep down, he knew it was futile. He took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and dried ink filling his senses as he slid the letter from its confines. He unfolded the crisp sheet, his eyes scanning the words, each sentence a soft blow, chipping away at the remaining fragments of their shared past. Ethan, the letter began, her voice echoing in his mind as he read. I know I've hurt you, deeply and irrevocably. I know that my silence, my inability to stand up to my family, was a betrayal. You were right to leave. You deserved more than half-hearted apologies and empty promises. I understand now, perhaps too late, that my fear of losing their approval blinded me to the true value of what we had. You saw me, Ethan truly saw me for who I was, flaws and all. My family, they only see what they want to see, a reflection of their own desires and expectations. You gave me a glimpse of a different life, a life free from the gilded cage, a life where I could be myself, not the carefully crafted image they expected me to portray. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Ethan. I just wanted you to know that I understand. I appreciate your strength, the strength it took to walk away, to choose your self-respect over a relationship built on shaky foundations. I will always cherish the memories we made, even though the ending is tinged with regret. Claire, he finished reading, the words hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. He folded the letter, the crispness of the paper a stark contrast to the fragility of its contents. He placed it within the album, a final chapter in a story that had ended too soon. He closed the album, the click of the clasp echoing in the quiet apartment. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that he had made the right decision. The heartbreak lingered, a dull ache in his chest, but it was no longer a consuming fire. It was a gentle ember, a reminder of a lesson learned, a catalyst for growth. He stood up, the setting sun painting the room in hues of orange and purple. He walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. He was alone, yes, but he was also free. He had chosen himself, his own worth, his own peace of mind. And in that choice, he had discovered a strength he hadn't known he possessed. The city lights twinkled, a million stories unfolding beneath the darkening sky. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, a sense of anticipation for the story he would write, the life he would build, brick by brick, on his own terms.